Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Workplace Benchmark Report 2026 webinar. I see a couple of people have already joined in, but I would still give, let's say, 60 to 90 seconds for people to join in. And till we do the wait, why don't we tell ourselves, each other, where are we joining in from today? Maybe you can drop it in the chat. So, Rudy, where are you joining in from?
Oh, from Belgium.
Oh, nice. Oh, I see people joining in from some interesting locations already. We have Amsterdam, Berlin. And between the two of us, Rudy, I think you are, it would be safe to say that you are the data nerd. So I'm really counting on you today.
Yeah, of course, no problem. I will walk you through the presentation and give some insights. So people are starting to join
Yes,
more and
and I
more.
see the locations as well. It's interesting to see people all across Europe are joining in.
Yeah. So let's start in half a minute or something, or 1 minute, I think.
Yes, that would be great. So, well, I'm excited, Rudy. Are you?
I am ready. Looking forward to the questions and the feedback. There's a lot of work to get it completed, the report. We're quite proud about it. So
Indeed.
let's the feedback.
Well, then I think I would say that I was lucky to get a pre sneak peek into the report already. So I'm more excited than you are. Okay, great. So I see a lot of people have already joined in, and it would be safe to say that we can now start the webinar.
Yeah.
First of all, welcome everyone to this webinar. We are so excited to have you here. And today we would be talking about our Workplace Benchmarking Report 2026. When we look at workplaces today, they often appear perfectly designed on the surface: bright, modern spaces, good furniture, plenty of desks and meeting rooms. On a slide, everything looks as if it should work. But when you talk to people using those spaces every day, a different picture emerges. Some days the office feels too quiet to justify the cost. Other days it feels chaotic, and leaders are left wondering whether they have too much space, too little, or simply the wrong kind of space. Over the last few years, we've changed how we work much faster than we've changed where we work. Hybrid habits, new expectations around flexibility, pressure on real estate costs, and a stronger focus on well being and sustainability are all colliding in the targets redesigned, are all colliding in the same square meters. Many organizations are trying to solve this with policies alone: return to office rules, new occupancy, different floors, but without a clear view of what is actually happening in their building, it's hard to know which decisions are truly helping and which are just shifting the problem around. What I found most interesting is that the questions are now the same across roles. Whether you are in workplace, HR, real estate, finance, IT, you're probably asking, how do we create spaces that people genuinely want to use, that support collaborations, focus, and that also make sense financially and environmentally? And how do we move away from opinions and isolated anecdotes towards something more grounded and comparable? That's exactly the conversation we want to support today. We are here to move beyond the idealized photos of offices and workplaces and look at how these workplaces are really performing and what we can learn from organizations that are further along on this journey. So, without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to my amazing colleague Rudy to take us through the report and some great insights behind it. Over to you, Rudy.
Thank you, Colin, for the nice introduction. Well, we prepared a presentation, which we also will share to you after the session. We first will walk you through the scope of the analysis, a few words about terminology, because it's important for you to understand the difference between occupancy, utilization, vacancy, what is a whisker box, and so on. So that part is quite important to understand. Also the next part being the results of the benchmarking. What I will do is I will go through the different pages of the results. I will give some additional information, additional input on each of the different slides. And then the most important slide might be the key benchmarking insights. That we will share you what we have learned from the analysis and from the benchmarking, and what are the possible steps for customers. The last part, we will answer some questions that might pop up during the presentation, and you can put in your questions, and then we will pick out some of the questions to answer at the end. If we are not able to answer all the questions, then we will send you afterwards an email with the answers of the different questions. Okay, let's start with the scope. So if you look to the scope of the benchmarking data, we look to 2025 data over 55 different companies, 236 buildings were involved, spread over 20 countries, and almost 81,000 sensors were involved in the study. Now, what is important in every benchmarking, and I'm not always sure that that is always done, is that the data quality of the sensors must be very up to date. What we have done is we have gone through all the 236 buildings, and we looked after the data quality to be sure that we had the same settings, the same configuration, the same exclusions, so we can compare apples to apples and making the data very powerful. We also looked into different industries, which you can list up there. And what is important, what makes us different from other analysis is that we not only look to the active occupancy data. Active occupancy means the data from the sensors, but we also simulate passive occupancy, is the moment that people are not in the desk but it's occupied. We look into utilization data, which means the number of people in the meeting room. We also look into the vacancy numbers, so how much free space or overcapacity we see in the different buildings. And we even added a behavior aspect where we look into the data from reservations compared to really uses of the space. This makes this benchmarking quite unique, not only looking to the sensor data, but go a step further with the different data sets. Well, terminology, I'm not going to read through all the information you see here, but I'm just going to explain high level what are the most important things to know for this session. So occupancy means something is occupied or not, meaning somebody is sitting in a desk or in a meeting room or is not there. It's like a 0-1 situation. We measure on a quarterly level. So what we see is that there is averages, there is maximums, there is medians, and there's a certain spread of the occupancy. There's a slight difference between average occupancy and median occupancy. Average means you take all the data and divide by the number of items, where median is you take the lowest result, you rank it to the highest result, and you take the middle score. They're quite similar, but a bit different. And the reason that we explained is because the whisker boxes that I will explain to you later, they use medium, where in other pictures you will see the average occupancy. The maximum occupancy is very important. Average is interesting to know, but the maximum shows you where are the pain points or where are the potential issues or opportunities that we see. The maximum occupancy means we're going to look to the whole year and which is the highest hour in the whole rank that was an occupancy. For instance, if there was at a certain moment 80 out of the 100 spaces occupied, you have an 80% occupancy. Mostly on a Thursday afternoon, we see in the data that happens, and the minimums are very often on a Friday afternoon when people are starting getting home. Now, utilization is another parameter, and utilization means the number of meeting spaces, of meeting room seats that are occupied compared to the capacity. If you have a meeting room of 10 seats and 5 people are in that room, it means you have a 50% utilization and 100% occupancy, because occupancy is just a yes/no. And it's the combination of the two that makes it how well a certain collaboration space has been used. I'll come back on that later in the presentation with the data and the result. And there is some surprising things coming out of utilization data. Vacancy is also a very important parameter, because vacancy is something that you don't get just out of the sensors. It's something that we calculate through our so-called space simulator. That's a tool that we developed that calculates what is the vacancy or the overcapacity per building, per floor, per zone, or per other selection. And the vacancy is calculated starting from the maximum occupancy, so the worst case moment that you have measured how high the occupancy was. We correct that with the so-called passive occupancy. That means if somebody goes for half an hour to the toilet or goes to a meeting room or go for a smoke, in that moment the sensor will not notice that the person is gone, but the workplace is still occupied. So we simulate that passive occupancy through our space simulator, and then we even add a 5% buffer. And what is then left over, that is your vacancy or your overcapacity. And I call it the worst case scenario or minimum risk, because it means that if you have a 10% vacancy and you have 100 spaces, that you could take out 10 of the spaces and still will always have enough space for the uses of that floor or building. So it shows you how easy it is to reduce certain volumes without any risk. We have also some information related to behavior of the people, and that's more about booking or reservations. There's a term called not booked and occupied. That is a percentage that shows how much of the time people didn't book a meeting room, but they went into the meeting room. So they occupied without using the booking system. And that should, of course, not be too high, because it's an incorrect use of your booking system. But even more important is the second parameter, the booked and not occupied. It means that somebody booked a meeting room or made a recurrent meeting reservation, but he didn't show up. Or it was a meeting of 3 hours and only 2 hours was used and the last hour was then not occupied. Also, that percentage is an important element to steer the behavior of the end users and to improve the availability of meeting rooms and meeting space. The box plot or whisker box is one of my favorite ways of visualizing data, because you cannot see only the averages and the max, but you can also see the spread and the way that the minimum is compared to the other parameters. I've explained here in a bit how it works. A whisker box is like a copy from a data set where you have the median in the middle, and that's the middle measurement of the whole selection. The maximum is the highest observed measurement. For instance, if you are in a floor with 100 seats and there is 80 people on a Tuesday afternoon, it is 80%, which is your maximum. Your minimum is the lowest on the other side. For instance, on a Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock, maybe only 10% of the people are there. So that's your lowest. And then the blue box is the 50% around the median. And so most of the measurements are around that blue box. You might also see now and then those dots appearing in the presentation. These are extremely high or extremely low measurements, and they need to be reviewed if they are really the correct way of working. For instance, it might be that you have on a Friday afternoon a party in a certain floor and there is a lot of people for that period. It's an extreme high occupancy at the moment, but we should not take that into account in our calculations, of course. Another way to visualize the box plot is via the Gaussian curve. This is maybe something you recognize from school, where you have in the middle the median measurements, the 50% around that median, and you also have in the beginning very low measurements, and also at the end very high measurements. If you would compare this with the length of people in Europe, and then you have like between 1.60 meters and 1.80 meters are most of the people. Of the man, there is also some people more than 2 meters, but also some smaller persons like 1.20 meters and so on. And the reason that we convert this into a whisker box is because then you can compare in a very easy way the different buildings, the floors, the zones, the categories, and so on. And you not can only compare the averages, but all the extreme data. We also use space categories, and also this is something we started like almost 10 years ago when we started building the dashboards. These are 3 categories that we oblige our customers to use. And so the workspaces concentration spaces, and collaboration. That's a fixed parameter, but under that, the customers can select their own names that they use as room categories. So this is all flexible per customer, but they all have these three main groups. And why did we do that 10 years ago? To be able to benchmark. If you only use the names of the categories of the individual customers, everybody has his own names of phone booths, cockpits, and so on. By doing this, we were able to benchmark in between all the 236 buildings with the same setup and the same way of configuring. So these were some words about the terminology and the scope. We now dive into the details of the report. This is the content of the report. I already explained to you point number 10. You can find that in the report at the end if you want to read it through again. We're going to start with the first 4 items, which is occupancy data related. And this is a type of data you will probably also will find in other benchmarking reports. The vacancy is then the next one that we will walk you through. That's the overcapacity, and that's only possible through that space simulator. So that's quite unique in the market that we have that type of information in the benchmarking report. Then we will move to the utilization data. Utilization, as I just explained, is the number of people in a meeting room compared to the capacity. And there we can then validate occupancy versus utilization to see which are the spaces that are used correctly and which are the opportunities for the ones that are not used correctly. Then we take the behavior part into account, the reservation. What do we see there as benchmarking and what can we learn from that and where are the opportunities to improve without having a large investment? That's one of the benefits of reservation optimization, because we can save there 5% that people don't have a meeting planned and don't show up. Then you create 5% more availability of the meeting rooms. And we have the final conclusion slide, and then the terminology, as just said, we already explained that in the previous slides. Okay, let's start with the occupancy data. This is the first graph where we see the whisker box. And this box on its own shows you the data of the 236 buildings, where they are with their average occupancy. What you see immediately is that there's a large spread. It means there is some companies that have an average occupancy higher than 60 and even close to 80, but they are very rare. That's why they became a dot. There are not so many of them. There is also some in our benchmarking that have a very low average occupancy. That might be companies that have a very strict home working policy that they can work 3 or 4 days from home, and that's why the occupancy over the week is very low. But most interesting is, of course, the median or the average occupancy is about 34%. When I talk for the first time to customers and I ask you, what do you think is your occupancy? They all expect to be 60 or 70%. Now, that was possible before COVID, but once you moved into the home working methodology and concepts, then even 45 is a quite challenging average. And that's why we also say best practice in a flexible workplace concept is 45%. We see that 50% is between 27 and 42, and that's the blue box. And as I said, the one here on the right-hand side, they are most of the time companies that don't have a home working concept implemented or moved already back to the full office methodology. What is also important is that you have the same data settings, and these are the settings that we used for our analysis, and we used always during working hours. We excluded the weekends. We also excluded the holidays. If not, if you don't exclude holidays, your averages will be even much lower. So this is really the averages based on data in a normal spectrum or normal uses of space. Now, this is the overall for all the buildings together. And here I make that visualization again with that curve to see here you have the most used. There is some of them more extreme on the high end and also a few on the low end. Now, if you split this up in the different industries, then you see here quite some difference between the industries, where energy utilization and sustainability has a very large spread. This means it's less predictable, that like there is some of them very low, some of them very high. And if you compare that, for instance, with the logistics, this is more like a condensed, predictable pattern, but they never go higher than the 50%. So here you have the most, let's say, vacancy potential or the most potential to optimization compared to the other sectors. So results are very important that you compare them with the right peers to make conclusions for your own situation. The next slide is about the different days of the week. And I see a lot of companies that are not focusing enough on this type of patterns. And they say we have complaints that people don't have enough space. But in 90% of the time, it's because it's on a Tuesday afternoon or a Thursday at 10 o'clock that there is a peak. But there is on a Friday only 20% occupancy. What you see here is again the average for all the buildings. So that's going to be different per building, even per floor. Per zone and per department. But if you take the overall picture, it's not surprising that Friday is the lowest average occupancy. And this pulls down, of course, that average that I just talked about. Also, Monday is slightly lower, and the three others are comparable. Where in the past, Wednesday was more like also a lower one compared to the rest, we see now that it's quite equal from an average point of view. If you take the maximum occupancy into account, then we see a similar trend. Of course, the maximum is a bit higher, but this is the average of the maximum. Some companies have a maximum on Tuesday close to 100%, and they have, of course, some challenges there, but they have a very low on Friday, for instance. So spreading over the week is quite important in success of the average occupancies. Okay. Then another comparison that we put into the report is the comparison between those three categories. As I said, collaboration, focus or concentration, and workspaces. And this was possible because we oblige all our customers to put their individual space categories into our three fixed ones. And in this way, we can analyze like 33% is the average for all the workspaces in the database. The category concentration or focus is a bit lower, which is expected because in those spaces people don't sit all day, they go in and out, so there is a lower average. What was surprising to see is that the meeting rooms were much higher than the workspaces. In the first glance, you would say, okay, it's higher, it's better usage, but you will see later on in the presentation that's not the case. It's not because the occupancy is higher that is better used. And I will say about what we come back on that later. It's about the utilization also. It's not because it's occupied that it's occupied correctly, depending on the number of people that are in that meeting room. I'll come back on that later in the presentation. So most opportunities we see then, of course, in the workspaces and in the concentration, but also in the meeting rooms, we see that because of the number of people. Okay, these four were like, let's say, the more standard data sets that we analyzed, and we see that also in other benchmarking comparisons. The vacancy is a quite unique way of visualizing benchmarking data because the vacancy is calculated out of the space simulator tool that we developed. And so we simulate certain parameters additional to the sensor data to come up what is the real vacancy or the overcapacity, or in Dutch, the leegstand. Again, we use the same type of graphs to visualize the whole spectrum. And what is surprising to see is that the median or the average is around 20%. It means that if you would take 1 out of 5 workspaces out of the offices, that you will still always have enough space as an average, because there is some companies that have sometimes shortage of space. If you see here, there's even negative vacancy, meaning that they use the buffer of 5% that we put in our system. So they have some challenges and issues even at the building level, where other companies have like a 50%, around 50% vacancy, meaning that they could delete or transform into something else half of their spaces, and they still will have enough space to do their work. Now, a very important comment on this is that this is at building level flexibility. And I will come back on that term a few times. Building level flexibility means that you allow people to enter in the building and they can choose at each floor where to sit. Because even if you have a 50% vacancy, it might be that at floor level or at zone level or departmental level, you have shortage of space. That's where most of the time we see opportunities for companies that they focus on floors are full and zones are full, but in the total flexibility concept of the building, there is most of the times more than enough space. And that shows also the data, like 1 out of 5 on average, and even 50% in some cases is the vacancy or the overcapacity. We split it up here in a few countries to see that there is some differences. Shows you also there the maximums are not always the same. And the next part is about utilization. Utilization means the number of meeting room seats are occupied compared to the capacity. Also there we have some interesting results. What we have seen, and you see here a graph, the different industries, and then how much percent of the time there is only one person in a meeting room. And it must be a surprise that it is like 32% of the time. And if you think about it, how is that possible that in 32% of the time, on average, there's only one person in the meeting room? Now, there are several reasons. And one of them is people sometimes go to the meeting room before starting and they are alone before the rest will arrive, or at the end, somebody stays a bit longer. But more important is that we see that very often one person takes a meeting room for a longer period. Seems like a private office claiming, and that people are misusing the fact that there is smaller concentration spaces, or maybe not enough concentration spaces, and they use smaller meeting rooms as their preferred workspace. That, of course, need to be avoided and can be very well simulated and visualized through the data to bring it down to an acceptable level. It also can be that you have too large meeting spaces, or it can be that you don't have enough concentration spaces. If people don't find a space to their call, they will jump into a meeting room and do it there, even when it's not available at that moment. So what I said, okay, what are the possible causes? The wrong category mix. Maybe you have not enough concentration spaces and too many meeting rooms, and the opposite around. It can be also a quality item. Yes? For instance, some of the concentration spaces I've seen are quality-wise not comparable to a meeting room. They are like phone booths or very small, or the HVAC system is not adapted to it, and people cannot sit there for a longer time. Okay, then people start moving to a more comfortable work environment, being a small meeting room, which is at that moment available. And then the last point that you see is that private offices is quite an important element to bring that up, to make sure that that's not being used, because that creates, of course, frustration and also a shortage of meeting rooms. This graph is a very interesting graph because it combines not only the occupancy data, which is the horizontal axis, it's also compared to the utilization. So here you see whether there was somebody or not in that space, and here is it how much percent of the meeting room capacity is being used on average. In this graph, we now visualized all the buildings, but you can do the same graph on a building level, but then for each individual meeting room. And then you can really make a strategy out of the results. For instance, if you have a high occupancy and a high utilization, that's a correct usage of spaces or buildings. And all the 4 other items are opportunities for improvement. And if you are ending up in this blue square, then it means that whether your meetings are too large, because people never reach the right utilization, or you have that problem of the private room usage, or a combination of it. When it's on the left-hand side, then it means it is hardly being used. And when it's used, it's always full. These are typically the boardrooms and the training rooms that you have in companies, where the reduced meeting room space, here you just have too many of this type. And by reducing the number, you can also save some square meters. And the last one is the red one. This is most of the time linked to comfort parameters. People don't use it, and if they use it, it's not in line with the capacity. So if I analyze meeting rooms, occupancy is interesting to know, but it's the combination that makes it really powerful, and also the opportunities come out of that combination of the two. So if you have the possibility to measure as well occupancy as utilization for meeting rooms, please do so, because that will give you much more opportunity for optimization, sizing the meeting rooms correctly, and making sure you have the best solution for the end users. Before the final conclusion, I will focus on reservation, and this is the first one where we look into behavior, because till now we always talked about how can you optimize your capacities. The mix is all linked to architectural design and optimization physically. Well, a lot of opportunities lie also in making people aware about how they use the space. Not only about occupying it, but also the reservation. And this is what we see in this overview. There is two parameters that we took out of our data to show in this model. One is about not booked and occupied, where we see that like 5% is best practice, and the other is booked and not occupied. And not booked and occupied means that people jump into a meeting room and they don't take the time to make a reservation. There might be a few reasons for that. One reason is that it is too difficult to use a booking system. They need to go to their desk, and they need to log into Outlook and do the reservation. Well, if they have a system next to the door where they just can scan a QR code, or they can do it via mobile app, it's easier to do. So that's one reason why we see that people have their higher percentages. It can also be that they just don't follow the rules that are applied in the organization. The booked and not occupied, the so-called no-shows, is even more important, because that means that people booked the meeting room, but they didn't show up or they didn't use the whole period. And also there might be several reasons. One typical reason is that people make recurrent meetings and they don't decline them, or they don't cancel them before the meeting. And we see there that in the average of the whole 236 buildings, that's 11%. It means that 1 out of 10 meeting rooms that are booked are not used. And that creates frustration, because what happens then is that some people want to book a meeting room, they don't find anything in the system, but when they walk around, they see like a few meeting rooms empty because people didn't show up. And this is all about awareness and making people aware that if you don't cancel beforehand, there is no availability, you lose that, and that 10% means 10% of your square meters of the meeting rooms is wrongly being utilized. We can bring that down to the 5% or even lower. It's a saving and is an improvement without large investments, but of course, bringing awareness to the end users and to the people. Okay, the final conclusion that we then made one slide, and I'm not going to read through all the text, but what is important is that flexibility concept that I talked about, building flexibility floor, is very important to understand what that means for your organization and what are the opportunities there. Also, the space category mix is important, making sure that you don't have too many meeting rooms and too few concentration spaces and not enough workspaces, but have a good balance there, have a win-win. And also the end user behavior impact. Don't underestimate how important that is. If people always come on a Tuesday afternoon to a meeting and every department does it at the same moment, of course you have their peaks and you have problems where it could be maybe spread over other days. Same with the booking and the reservation data. So what I want to say is stop planning for averages. Average is interesting to see, but that doesn't say anything about the challenges and the complaints you have in your company. You'll need to focus and design for peaks and for patterns. Make also sure that you rebalance your space categories, create space through the reservation behavior, as I just said. And what I also see is very often there is too many large meeting rooms and not enough small meeting rooms. Also there you can split a large meeting room into small ones and have more capacity by doing that. And I also want to challenge companies to think on their flexibility level more at building and not at floor or zone or even departmental level. Now, what we learn out of this data, and these are, I think, the key insights and the most important elements to remember out of this presentation, we don't only look to occupancy data, but we look into vacancy and behavior-related items, so it makes it broader than what I see in most of the benchmarking results. 45% is already a good average best practice. Before COVID, that was 60, but if you have 45, that is good, especially if you have 1 or 2 days of home working. 32% of the time, there's only one person in the meeting room, and the main reasons might be private offices, or wrong usage, maybe too large meeting rooms. Try to bring that down and make people aware of it. but you only can bring that awareness if you have the data and you can show that the data that it really is happening. 1 out of 10 reservation is a no-show, and that's an easy way to increase your capacity and availability with a low investment. But of course, you need to use the data, compare it, show it to the end users, and make them aware about they can make that change, bring them also involvement in that. The vacancy simulation, we use the worst case simulation, and even then we see 1 out of 5 on average is never being used at building level, at floor level and zone level. We see, of course, there are challenges, but if you would have the flexibility at a higher level, there is always enough free space that you can do something else with it. That can be simulated through the space simulator. And then the last item in the slide, building flexibility shows that at building there's a lot of free space, not at zone and floor. So the flexibility strategy is key for success. And how can you create that flexibility strategy? You need to give the end users the visibility of the available spaces. That can be done by putting at the ground floor of your building a kiosk where you can visualize the occupancy of the different floors so people can go directly to the right floor, or you do it via a mobile app or via meeting room displays, but give the end user the tools so they can work in a flexible way and can go directly to those spaces where you still have enough space. It doesn't make sense to send somebody always to the same floor and that floor is always full and the other floors have never higher than 60-70% occupancy at the same time. Voilà. And to 35 minutes through the presentation. I haven't checked if there's a lot of questions, but I'm sure Palak looked at it. So give you the word, Palak, for a few moments about the questions and some general insights that you have.
Yes, sure. Thank you so much, Rudy. That was such an insightful session. And I know this matters now more than ever that I am dialing in from a one-person meeting room. So I saved some space there. Based on the session, I really stuck to the point where you said that it's difficult for organizations to even, have an ambition of 45% occupancy after the COVID workplace scenario. And it left me wondering that there are so many ambitions that any organization now needs to achieve alongside the utilization of their space is to ensure the employee experience on one hand, and then coming all the environmental factors associated with it. So space is kind of sitting at the intersection of all of these elements: the operational efficiency part, the tenant experience, occupiers ensuring their employees are happy inside the office spaces, or employees thinking that, I need to go into this kind of office space right now. It is such an intriguing discussion that opens up so many challenges, so many discussion points for everyone on both sides of the things. So as we take a step back from everything we've heard today, I think one thing is very clear: that workplace is no longer just a cost line or a set of square meters to optimize. It's becoming an enterprise asset that directly shapes how people feel, how quickly they can move, how confidently the decision makers can make decisions. What we see across many organizations is that the real challenge isn't the lack of ideas. Most of us already know the levers we could pull: consolidating space, redesigning floors, as you said, introducing new tech, and evolving policies. The harder part is knowing which of these moves will actually matter most in your context, and being able to explain the why in a way that brings HR, workplace, finance, and IT onto the same page. That's where a more structured view of your workplace reality becomes powerful. When you can point to clear patterns instead of just talking about trends or thought leadership, we shift the conversations from defending opinions to aligning around evidence. It becomes easier to prioritize, to say no to the noise, and to focus our time and investment on the changes that will genuinely move the needle for our people and our portfolio. My hope is that you leave this session with a slightly different lens, seeing your workplaces as not static assets but as living systems that you can continuously tune with better data, better questions, and better cross functional dialogue. And with that, we can let the numbers and stories we've shared today help you guide your next decisions rather than dictate them. With that being said, I'm glad to see that there are a lot of interesting questions already on the board. I do have mine already, but I'm going to look on the Spacewell Workplace app as when Rudy will be in office next and ask those questions in person. For now, I'm going to ask some questions that we've received from our audience. So here's the first one, Rudy. Why the vacancy calculation is always at minimum risk?
Um, so how we calculate the vacancy is based on the highest occupancy that we measured in the whole year that we use the data. So the worst case moment of occupancy. And then we add on that an extra parameter being the passive occupancy, and that's a moment that people are not on the desk. The sensor doesn't measure them, but it's still occupied. So that's between 8 and 16% what we see. And then we even add an extra 5% buffer to avoid that we calculate that the whole floor or building is 100% full, because we notice that even if you have a 95% occupancy, people feel too crowded on a certain floor, so we created a 5%. And what is then left over is like the real vacancy, meaning if you take out that percentage out of your portfolio, you will still have enough space taking into account the 5% buffer and the passive occupancy. That's why we say it's a no risk result.
That's interesting. And that's why I said at the start of the webinar, Rudy, that you are the data nerd here. But thanks for your answer. And so I'm looking at a lot of questions. So let me just pick the next one. Oh, here's an interesting one. So, Rudy, can you explain us building flexibility versus floor flexibility?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I always notice if I use that flexibility term that it's not that easy to understand what it is. So I will try to explain it with an example. Imagine you have a building with 3 floors, and in each floor you have certain departments that always go to the same floor and will not make use of the other floors. So it might be that in certain floors you have very often a very high occupancy, maximum occupancy. For instance, floor number 2 has a 80% active occupancy plus 10% passive plus the buffer, so it feels crowded and people complain. But if you look to the data, at the same moment that those complaints occur, the other 2 floors might still have free capacity. And that's what we mean by, if you have building flexibility, we look to the data as of everybody can sit in every space in the building. It will create more opportunity than when you use floor flexibility. And even some companies go a level lower. They use zone flexibility. They say in a certain floor there is this area where departments, finance and sales are sitting together, and they are not allowed to sit in another. Then you will create even less opportunity, or you will create quicker an issue, because people will feel that in their area it's full, but they are not aware about the other areas, and they don't have the visualization. And that's why I also said flexibility at building is very important, but if you don't give the people the tools to visualize that, they will never be able to utilize it on an optimal way.
Okay. And yes, it is. I'm just thinking that does that apply like for any size of portfolio, or we put a like a filter there?
Yeah, of course, if you only have one floor with 50 seats, then it's already flexible probably at that level, but it's more for multiple floors where you don't have the visual check of the availability on the other floors. And the larger the building, the more seats you have, the more important it becomes, of course. We have customers where they have 20 floors, and they have in 10 of the floors issues, but for the whole building, there is still 20% overcapacity. So it's just about making sure that people move to the right floors, or moving some departments in between floors, or making them aware that there is enough capacity in other places than they are used to go.
Oh, that's interesting. And probably to different side, because I was looking at the question, and this is a thought that kind of intersects with what you're saying around the size of portfolio, and someone aligns with my thought and my question as well, which says that what's the minimum time range to monitor space usage in a large office before obtaining recommendations to adjust or reduce space? Because since we're already talking about multi-floor and larger portfolios already.
So you understand well, the question is about how long you should have data for making some conclusions for offices. Well, what I always say, you need at least 3 months of data to be able to say something. So if you measure only a few weeks, of course, it might be a few weeks that there is just a moment there is no peaks or no high volume. So minimum 3. But if you really want to use the space simulator and have also the maximums and the peaks, you should have 1 year, because it might be that that peak that still will come in the future is not in your data set, and then you start calculating vacancy levels which are not in line with the real usage. So 3 minimum for averages and for making some first analysis. But if you really want to calculate vacancy, potential improvements, and simulate the opportunities, then I always recommend 1 year data before making conclusions.
Oh, that's a long time.
Yeah.
That's nice. And it is so interesting that how efficient these data points can be for any decision maker to understand and evaluate the current patterns versus projecting how they intend to make their patterns more realistic, more optimized in a way. That is something that I'm really excited to think about, and probably I'm going to deep dive after this session on this subject as well. Coming back to the questions, Rudy, I see a lot of interest, so I'm assuming that you're really given some people food for thought for the entire week. So I'll quickly hop on to my next question, which is, how do you define the optimal space category mix?
Yeah. So I think what the question means, you have those three different levels: workspace, concentration, and collaboration. And what is the optimal mix? So there is not really an optimal mix as a whole, because every company has its own way. We have some benchmarking data on that. It is not in the report today. But what's important is that through our space simulator, we can visualize what are the vacancy for each individual of those categories. So we can see that might be 100 workspaces left over, and there is like a shortage of concentration spaces, and there's not enough small meeting rooms. Then you can transform some workspaces into the meeting rooms and concentration, and you balance out that mix. And that mix is then, for that solution, the optimal mix. But there's not like a standard. I know it's like 10% is concentration spaces and 12% meeting rooms, but really to know it well is look into the data, use a space simulator to validate, and then optimize it even before investing in the changes.
Okay, that's that's really a nice direction also for us as as software solution creators, to understand that how these technology tools are playing such an important role, that when aligned rightly or when intended to use rightly, it can really help these organizations not just save costs but adhere to the compliances with relevance to environmental regulations that are coming in the picture, right?
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Great. So, in the interest of time, so we do have a lot of questions already, but I picked some of my favorites today. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to pick one last question, Rudy, for you. And for
Okay.
all the remaining questions, we will, please be assured, we will reach back to you with the answers. Uh, and in my closing note, I will share a bit more about that. So, the last question here is, Rudy, if you can give us some insights on how can we improve booked and not used score.
Yeah, the book and not use score. What it means is that people made a reservation, but they didn't show up. And the main element there is behavior change. Very often people or companies or departments don't know what that percentage means. And we see very often differences in floors and building, that in one floor we see there 20% booked and not used, and another floor with the same type of people, only a 5%. If you can show that data to the responsibles of those floors or the responsible of the teams, and show, like, look, in a similar environment, your colleagues do this much better than your team, it motivates them to bring that number down. And if you can inform them also that by reducing 10% of that booked and not used, you will have 10% more availability of your meeting rooms. And that's very often where they complain about. So they can solve the problem by using the system correctly. But for that, of course, you need to have the data visualized, you have the data compared, you need to communicate that to the end teams. It's a kind of a change management process that you need to go through, but it's really powerful once you start involving the end users and the managers of those end users to improve something what they complain about, and they can do it by themselves.
Yeah, and while you were answering that question, I could really connect the dots through the entire report that how technology versus using the technology, having the right data in place, and attaching it to the behavior patterns of the end users or the decision makers makes so much sense when you can clearly visualize all of them together, right?
Yeah,
So
okay.
I see that how that the flow of the report kind of connected all the dots together right when you were answering this question. So thanks a lot for that, Rudy.
You're welcome.
Great. So I think this was a Thursday morning well spent. And I thank you again, Rudy, for taking us through the presentation and to all the participants who joined us today. It was indeed a great report. We worked so hard on it and we were glad to share it with you all today. And a lot of interest, a lot of questions from the attendees that kept us motivated through the entire session. So, for all the questions that have not been answered in today's session, as I said, we will get back to you with the answers after the end of the session, as Rudy mentioned at the start, that you will receive the recording and your a recording of the session with the presentation and your answers if you've shared any questions. If you are already working with our platform, please feel free to reach out to your CSM or your contact at Spacewell to request a demo or a workshop on how to read your own data into and turn it into smarter decisions. And if you are not, well, we are excited to get in touch with you. So please, with our follow up email, you can respond to that directly or reach out to us directly. You can reply to our recording and slides that we will share with you after the webinar and click on the request meeting button as well. We would love to have a one on one conversations with you directly. And with this, I would like to end this webinar and I would like to wish all of you, all those who are here with us today, a very nice day ahead. And thank you so much for joining.
Thank you all. Have a nice day.
Yes, thank you, Rudy. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.